Now to Gaza, and the new group delivering aid to people there, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, says it has paused the distribution of food until Thursday. This announcement comes after dozens of desperate people seeking aid were shot dead in recent days after Israeli troops opened fire. The UN's aid chief said Gazans being killed while seeking food aid was the result of what he said were deliberate choices to deprive them of essentials to survive. Some Gazans are depending on other sources, but food across the entire territory is scarce.
A displaced woman in Gaza City in search of food for her grandchildren. But she leaves empty-handed. Back at the tent with her family, they improvise with what little they have. Zainab's daughter died of malnutrition, and she fears for her grandkids.
We are making 2 cups of rice with some water as a soup for the children. We're cooking them on a fire to soothe the children and feed them, but there's no food. What else are we going to feed them?
Her son says the shootings near aid centres are stopping him from going there.
Because of the daily killings of people who go to get aid, the unfair distribution of these items and the lack of enough aid, it never even crossed my mind to go there.
The new aid scheme is run by a private group with armed contractors and is backed by the US and Israel. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation has set up 4 distribution hubs, 1 in central Gaza and 3 in the south. But the United Nations and other humanitarian groups are boycotting it, saying it weaponizes aid. Since it began operations last week, dozens of Gazans have been shot to death while seeking aid, according to figures from Hamas officials, medics, and the Red Cross. Israel disputes this, saying its troops only fired on a group it deemed a threat on Tuesday. The UN has warned the attacks on aid sites may constitute a war crime.
Let's pick this up with James Elder, who speaks for UNICEF. He joins us from Gaza. Welcome to DW. Are we looking at what you might call teething troubles for a new organisation that's never worked in such extreme conditions before? Or was this disaster predictable?
Very predictable, unfortunately, Phil, and not with 2020 hindsight, where the United Nations at all levels has been saying this for a month. In terms of principles, it doesn't work. You simply, humanitarian aid has to go where people need it, has to be impartial, has to be neutral. During the ceasefire, Phil, there were 400 different distribution points so that we could flood the Gaza Strip, so mothers didn't have to go 15 kilometres, so grandmothers didn't have to do the same thing. That's how humanitarian aid works. So we made it very, very clear why it doesn't work. There's a practicality there too as well, and the point we were making is it's very dangerous for civilians to go into militarized zones. Now, unfortunately, we have seen the worst case scenario twice in 3 days with, as your correspondent said, with dozens of people killed in a very short space of time. So we know what works. We don't need a replacement for a system that has worked in dozens of countries over half a century, in crisis zones around the world. We know what works. We just need to be allowed to do it.
And to be absolutely clear, when UNAID Chief Tom Fletcher talks about deliberate choices to deprive people in Gaza of the essentials to survive, he is saying that the US and Israel have colluded to make this happen.
Well, I know what he means. Deliberate choices, my sense is that it's a deliberate choice to prevent the United Nations getting the amount of aid that we need in. As I say, during the ceasefire, 500 trucks a day. It changed the game, Phil. We saw malnutrition rates of children fall. We saw disease fall. We saw the amount of water increase dramatically for people. This is such a critical thing for those people who've been pushed to the absolute limits of survival. So the decisions being made to prevent that aid and now to create this system in the south, which is a veneer for aid. It really is about forcing a population to move to the south. It's about forcible displacement of a population, because if you want food, it's using food as bait. That is an entirely unacceptable proposition in a principled manner, but even in a practical manner, as we are now seeing with the large numbers of people who can't get there, and for those who do, what they risk simply to try to feed their family.
OK. And so with the GHF now closed down temporarily, they say, are there any critical programmes who are operating, still able to operate in Gaza?
Not anywhere near the scale needed. I mean, my organisation, UNICEF, is fortunate. We have a very broad mandate. So we are still getting nutrition supplies to some children. We're still doing fuel on the desalination plant to keep the water pumping. We're still doing vaccines. We do a lot of cash support. We do mental health support. But we know it's not enough. We know we're nowhere near our capacity. We know we're near what the population needs. And that's very similar for other agencies. They're working with a limited amount that they are allowed. If we are allowed to do our job, if we're allowed to save lives, that's what happens. But that starts by getting as many trucks in as possible on multiple routes, not one. We are coming, Phil, of course, off a 70-day blockade. No food, no water, no medicine for 70 days. And the only thing entering Gaza during those periods was bombs. So the population, again, has been pushed to the brink. This is my 5th time in Gaza since the horrors of October 7. But I've only been here this time for 24 hours. In that time, I've seen emaciated people, that universal symbol of hand to mouth showing how hungry they are. I've seen people go down to a site where there was a massacre because they desperately hope for food. I've been to a hospital where there was 3 drone strikes. I've met another little boy whose entire family was killed apart from his dad. In one day, people here have endured 600 days of this.
Right. The UN Security Council is expected to vote on a resolution calling for a ceasefire and unrestricted humanitarian access to Gaza. We'll assume it's going to fail because it's likely that the US will veto it. What does that mean for the prospects, not just of GHF working in Gaza, but of just alleviating the devastating situation that you've outlined so clearly?
I know we've called for a ceasefire hundreds of times, but it is a game changer. Ceasefires get hostages home. They end that abhorrence. During ceasefires and negotiations, more than 150 hostages went back to their families. Under military means, it's less than 10. A ceasefire, literally, as a mother said to me, lets me promise my child, you go to sleep tonight, you will wake up. They cannot do that, not in all good conscience. Children are well aware that their parents have lost the ability to protect them. And a ceasefire lets organisations like UNICEF and so many others flood the Gaza Strip with aid and begin this long, long recovery. Part of that being mental health, of course. So that's the game changer. Now, if there's not a ceasefire, if they don't land there, at least let the United Nations get aid in. This is not the first time we've been in a very difficult place, in a war zone with a lack of governance. We do that all the time. We have the systems in place to get aid in, to deliver it quickly, with dignity, without aid diversion. We're just not being allowed to do that. And in doing so, this separate mechanism, which is politicised and weaponised, is being created in its place. We have to go back to what works. It worked just 2 months ago. That is humanitarian organisations and brave NGOs on the ground who have been doing this in dozens of countries for 50 years.
OK, that's clear. Thank you for taking us through that. James Elder for UNICEF in Gaza. Thank you so much. And Goher Rahbour is a consultant colorectal and general surgeon from London. He's currently working at the NASA hospital in Khan Yunis. He actually operated on some of the people who were shot at those Gaza Humanitarian Foundation distribution sites. He joins us now in the middle of a power cut. Welcome to DW.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Having operated on those people injured in those dreadful scenes at the aid distribution centre, what sort of injuries did you see?
So in those particular patients, they had abdominal injuries, which are penetrating injuries going through bowel, multiple loops of bowel, and others injuries as well to the liver, to the spleen. And we actually extracted 2 bullets in a couple of the cases. So these are significant injuries. They have associated morbidity, they have associated mortality associated with them. So fairly horrific injuries. But also on the Sunday, there was 2 mass casualty events, and you saw the most horrific injuries with kids coming in with, one with a foot hanging off, another with at the knee, another kid I saw with injuries to the chest, and it just went on, and blood all over the floor, chaos. So fairly horrific scenes.
All right, and if we're talking about children maimed in that sort of way, we're not talking about accidental shooting, we're not talking about warning shots that might have been misdirected. It sounds deliberate.
So I can tell you clearly, in the two cases on Sunday morning, which were laparotomies on the abdomen, we removed the bullets. Fortunately, they've been doing really well. And one of them was 22 years of age, the other was 20. I spoke to them the following day. And we really just simply asked them, where were you? What happened? Who fired upon you? Simple questions. The first chap, he had gone to the food distribution center and had actually got the food. And as he was coming out, he said he saw the Israeli forces get out from tanks and fire upon him. So that was really clear. The second chap had said he had gone to the food distribution center, didn't actually get anything, but on the way out, he was fired upon by IDF. So they were quite, clear in terms of who did the firing and so forth.
And that's significant because the story that we're hearing from the IDF is that they fired warning shots as people approached them in a menacing manner. You're saying that, as far as you can tell, these people were shot and injured leaving the facility.
This is the simple narrative testimony that these two patients have given to me. We discussed this just like you're asking open questions to me. It's very simple. There's no coercion. Family are there. You're doing your post-surgical ward round, and that's the information you get. But I'm not surprised. I've been here 2 weeks in Gaza. Every single day, you are either getting injuries, kids, teenagers, or adults, with either bullet wounds or mainly from penetrating injuries due to the explosions that keep continuously going off. Just about half an hour ago, before coming to this interview, there's a 13-year-old kid who's had a piece of shrapnel go through his back. It's pierced his heart. The surgeons here are superb, absolutely phenomenal, the skills they have obtained. They were able to open up the chest, fix the hole in the heart, and now we can only pray that this child will recover. He's in intensive care now, but this is just a daily frequent thing that we see.
And we keep hearing that so many of the medical facilities there are bombed to smithereens. What sort of environment are you operating in? How are you getting the necessary medical supplies to treat people?
Yeah, so I think NASA seems to be the last functioning hospital, to my understanding. Within here, there is a lack of just everything. Antibiotics, simple things that you use to scrub when you do an operation. Chlorhexidine, betadine, there's a lack of that. Muscle relaxants have expired, which are needed, as part of a general anesthetic. But probably I think the most key thing for me is the nutrition. I had a meeting with the lead for nutrition a couple of days ago. There is no what you call parenteral nutrition, which goes through a vein. There's no enteral nutrition, which you feed through the mouth or down a tube, not even formula feed that you can give to kids. These people have severe malnutrition on whichever indices that you use, the mid-upper arm circumference, pedal edema, the WHO Z-scores, whatever you use, they have severe malnutrition in significant numbers. And that obviously leads to complications and so forth.
Understood. Can I, on a personal level, why are you there? What made you come to Gaza?
Well, I think it's been a long journey for me to come here, but obviously you see things over 19 months, the just absolute catastrophe that's happening. But I think you can put me aside. I think you have to just look at the people here. They're in a desperate situation, absolute desperate. They just keep on, day in, day out, carry on working. Every person I meet, they've had some of their relatives who have died tragically, but they still keep coming to work from a healthcare professional point of view. So I have the utmost respect for them.
OK, thank you so much for joining us, Surgeon Goher Rahbour in Khan Yunis. Thank you so much.
Thanks for having me. Thanks.
Arwa Damon is the president of INARA, the International Network for Aid, Relief and Assistance, and a former CNN correspondent. She's been to Gaza several times during the war. Arwa, it's great to have you back on DW. Now, the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, or GHF as it's known, has faced criticism basically since its recent creation. Now it has suspended aid deliveries after only a few days. What do you make of this new organization?
Well, quite frankly, just the fact that it exists is such a gross example of how the U.S. and Israel seem to be quite intent on ensuring that any sort of aid delivery effort is little more than a smokescreen, because to push forward an aid delivery mechanism that is so heavily militarized and, quite frankly, does not take any aspect of Gaza's realities into consideration is just a ludicrous proposal to begin with. The reason why the humanitarian community does not and did not want to cooperate or work with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation goes well beyond just the notion of militarization of aid. It is also due to the fact that we know what the conditions are in Gaza. And give you one example, we know that it is absolutely illogical to only set up 4 aid hubs for 2.2 million starving people. And we were warning that, it just wasn't going to work. I mean, I don't know how to say it in a more simple fashion. The mechanism that this entity is using does not work, and even under the best conditions would not have worked. There is logic behind the United Nations and other organizations having more than 400 distribution points in Gaza. There is logic behind the way that, humanitarian aid, when it's distributed by humanitarian organizations that actually know what they're doing, by and large is able to reach those who are so desperately in need. And the tragedy of all of this is that so many of us were warning that you cannot force large crowds of people to walk through very dangerous areas, effectively militarized zones, and expect that they are not going to get shot at by what is, and again, quite frankly, a very trigger-happy military force, and that is the Israeli Defense Force.
They, of course, say that they were reacting to suspicious activity. But I want to know how your organization specifically, you've been active in the Gaza Strip for so long, and you've been trying your best to get aid, especially to children affected by the fighting there. How are you navigating these new circumstances?
I mean, look, we're in the same position as everyone else. We can't get our aid trucks in. And so the best that you can do is try to source what is actually available in Gaza, which is very, very little and extraordinarily expensive. So, for a while, we were delivering hot meals, although, to call them a meal is not exactly accurate, given that it was little more than, a few scoops of rice. But that ran out roughly a month ago. And then on these rare occasions, we're able to source fresh vegetables, which may sound bizarre. But Gaza used to have a very robust local domestic agricultural industry. Now, the vast majority of the fields and the greenhouses are in areas under Israeli control, but there are a couple that the, farmers are still able to access. So, you end up buying a couple of kilos of fresh vegetables for roughly $80 to deliver to a few hundred, families that you're trying to support. But that's really sort of the best that we and other organizations can do. And the challenge is that, the logic behind what Israel and the U.S. have done in terms of setting up this Gaza Humanitarian Foundation is this very false allegation that Hamas controls the aid. And one would argue that if they wanted to prevent Hamas from, financially benefiting from aid, the best way to do that would be to ensure that aid no longer had a value on the market. The only reason why aid has value on the market, the only reason why, for example, a bag of flour costs $600 is because of scarcity. And that's why we keep saying flood the zone. Flood the zone so that we, the humanitarian sector, can do our jobs, and flood the zone so that aid no longer has a value on the market.
The UN Security Council is going to hold a vote tonight on a resolution calling for a ceasefire and unrestricted humanitarian access in Gaza. That is widely expected to be vetoed by the U.S. and therefore going to fail. What can be done to stop further suffering, especially from outside players? The international community really interested in putting an end to the suffering of civilians in Gaza.
I mean, look, the key right now really is, and really always has been, with the United States, because without their support, and we heard, French President Emmanuel Macron saying this, without the U.S. pulling its support from Israel, there is very little that, European countries and other outside nations, the Gulf countries, for example, can actually do. And at this stage, it really seems as if, despite these efforts that we're hearing about on the part of France and the UK potentially, as long as the United States continues to stand so firmly by Israel and give Israel basically carte blanche to do whatever it is that it wants to do in Gaza, the reality and the tragedy of this is that nothing is going to change. And so, if nations truly did want to actually try to see what cards they had to play to try to shift the course of what's happening, they would need to start looking at ways that perhaps maybe they could put pressure on the United States. Is anyone willing to go that far? We're going to have to wait and see. But quite frankly, the fact that the international community has allowed the situation to escalate to this point is atrocious.
That was Arwa, Damon, president of INARA. All the best to you and your team on the ground, of course, and for your work going ahead. Thanks so much for taking the time.